FA fam, welcome back in. Appreciate you all joining us. Somehow, Kev, it is week 6 already. I feel like we say this and we do the same thing every single year, but it is absolutely insane how quick it all goes by. We have a couple teams on bye weeks. We have some injuries to get through. So let's just go ahead and dive into our top 24 running back rankings for week 6. Going to start off with our RB1s for the week. They are as follows. We have Saquon Barkley at the top, followed by Derrick Henry, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jordan Mason, Breece Hall, Alvin Kamara, Josh Jacobs, Kenneth Walker, David Montgomery, James Conner, and Chuba Hubbard rounding out our RB1s. Kev, what do you like here in the RB1s? What do the people need to know about before setting their lineups?
Let's first start off with Bijan Robinson against the Panthers. Things have not been great for Bijan this season, despite playing 74% of the snaps, handling 62% of the rush attempts. He's currently the RB25, averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game. But on a per touch basis, Bijan still ranks 16th in missed tackles forced per attempt and 28th yards after contact per attempt. His bigger concern has been his lack of involvement in the passing game. Entering the season, the coaching staff talked up Bijan Robinson and how they're going to utilize him like CMC. That really hasn't been the case, though, as he's seeing only a 10% target share despite running the 6th most routes. This week brings a solid opportunity to get back on track with a matchup against the Panthers, who have allowed the 3rd most rushing yards, touchdowns, and the 2nd most fantasy points to running back. So this should be a really solid bounce back spot for Bijan Robinson. Next up is the Lions running backs. I mean, these guys just continue to be phenomenal. Both the running backs this season, with Gibbs is averaging 17.8 fantasy points per game, while Monty is averaging 17.4 fantasy points per game. Gibbs has a slight edge in terms of opportunities. Gibbs has played 53% of the snaps to 44% to Monty. Monty has handled a slightly larger rush share, averaging 48% of the rush attempts to 42% for Gibbs. But Gibbs has the edge in the passing game as he's ran 44% of the routes compared to just 27% for Monty. Either way, both of them are viable weekly starters, and this week is no different. The Cowboys have allowed the 14th most rushing yards, 3rd most touchdowns, and the 6th most PPR points to the position. So both of these guys are, for me, our top 10 running backs this week. Next up is Josh Jacobs. He struggled the first 4 weeks. However, he finally got back on track with 16.4 fantasy points last week against the Rams. He finished with 94 total yards and had a score on 20 total touches. He's still not being involved in the passing game despite running nearly 50% of the routes. He currently only has a 6% target share on the season, which will limit his upside every single week. However, this is not one of those weeks, as the Packers will face a Cardinals defense that has allowed the 2nd most rushing yards, the 7th most touchdowns, and the 9th most PPR points to the position. Next up is Kenneth Walker versus the 49ers. Last week was a really weird game script for Kenneth Walker and the Seahawks. Walker only had 5 total carries in that game. 2 of those were only in the first half, but they only had the ball for 8 minutes of that first half last week. But what really got Walker there was the 8 targets he received. Walker has continued to be more involved in the passing game. He has now seen 13 targets over his last 2 games. Better game scripts are ahead, but if he continues to see this type of work in the passing game, easily finish as a top 10 running back this season. This week, the Seahawks take on a 49ers defense that has allowed the 14th most rushing yards, the 13th most touchdowns, and the 13th most PPR points to the position.
Yeah, I really don't have a lot to add here for the RB1s. Just want to touch on Alvin Kamara real quick. I've seen some stuff floating around. He might not have a great matchup this week. Even if that was the case, it wouldn't matter to me because of the absolute elite usage that he is seeing. But the thing that you love to see here is that the Bucs have given up the 3rd most receiving yards to running back. So he's in a good spot, despite what some of your apps might say or what some of your favorite Twitter analysts may say. But let's go ahead and keep things rolling. Let's go over to our RB2s for the week. James Cook leads us off there at RB13, followed by DeAndre Swift, Chase Brown at 15 for us, Tony Pollard, Brian Robinson, Jonathan Taylor, Ramondre Stevenson, Najee Harris, Devin Singletary, J.K. Dobbins, Javonte Williams, and Travis Etienne, rounding out our top 24. Kev, same thing here. Anyone that you're higher or lower on the consensus, what do you want the folks to know?
Let's start things off with Chase Brown. I mean, Brown entered the season as one of my favorite late round sleepers this season. While he has started off slow, he has started to hit his stride. He has scored 23 and 16 fantasy points, respectively, each of the last 2 weeks. While Zach Moss remains the leader in the backfield with 62% of the snaps, we have seen Brown lead the backfield and rush attempts, handling just over 50% of the carries, and he has just seen 2 fewer targets than Moss. This week, we could see a bell cow workload for Chase Brown while Zach Moss deals with an ankle injury. If Moss were to miss, Brown would easily be a borderline RB1 this week against the Giants. Now, I will say this is the best matchup for Chase Brown, as the Giants have allowed the ninth fewest rushing yards, the seventh fewest touchdowns, but they have allowed the fifth most receptions and the third most receiving yards to running backs. If Moss were to miss, Brown becomes a must play based on volume alone. If Zach Moss does play, that would bump Chase Brown down to me, just be more of a flex option for me. Let's keep it moving here. Let's move on to DeAndre Swift versus Jacksonville. After scoring a combined 19 fantasy points in his first 3 games, Swift has exploded the last 2 weeks, scoring 50 fantasy points. Over the last 2 games, he has averaged 18.3 carries, 83 rushing yards, 4.5 receptions, and 59.5 receiving yards and 1 touchdown per game. Obviously, a small sample size, but a very good sign for his rest of season outlook. This week, the Bears will head to London to take on a Jags defense that has allowed the 8th fewest rushing yards, but the 10th most rushing touchdowns, the 2nd most receptions and receiving yards, and the 5th most PPR points position. He is a borderline RB1 this week. Next up is Tony Pollard versus Indy. Speaking of bounce backs, Tony Pollard continues to be one of the better draft day values heading into the season. We thought this would be more of a 50-50 split between him and Tajay Spears. However, this is just not what's happening right now. Pollard plays 64% of the snaps. He handles 58% of the rush attempts, as well as through the air. He runs 47% of the routes with a solid 13% target share on the season. He's currently the RB19 in fantasy points per game, but ranks 12th in yards after contact per attempt. He's done this while running behind one of the league's worst offensive line. For a little bit of context here, he's averaging 0.85 yards before contact, which only Brees Hall, Dario Gumbawale, Rashad White, and Ray Davis have had it worse than Pollard this season. This week, though, the Titans take on a Colts defense who have struggled against running backs this season, allowing the 4th most rushing yards, 13th most touchdowns, and the 8th most PPR points position. Next up is Javonte Williams versus the Chargers. While Javonte had a really rough start to the season, he has finally started to stack up some usable weeks. Last week against the Raiders, he handled 18 touches and racked up 111 total yards. He's still only averaging 9.6 fantasy points per game on the season, but over the last 2 weeks, he is averaging 13.4 fantasy points per game. While he has yet to score a touchdown, he has really shined through the air with a 13% target share and ranks 17th in yards per route run. If he can finally start scoring some touchdowns, Williams could be a solid RB2 rest of season. This week, though, is a bit tough of a matchup as the Chargers have allowed the 10th fewest fantasy points to running backs, but his pass catching use is going to continue to make him a decent play, even in less than ideal circumstances. Next up is this Giant situation. I do think Devin Singletary will play. Last week, basically, it was a game time decision with Devin Singletary, and they basically decided to sit him down for Tyrone Tracy. But Tyrone Tracy was phenomenal. 18 carries, 130 total yards, good for 14 PPR points. He looked explosive. It really reminds me a lot of a young Tony Pollard. We will have to monitor the situation because it does sound like Singletary should be back this week. Either way, whoever starts should be viewed as a solid RB2 this week against the Bengals. The Bengals have allowed the 7th most rushing yards, the 8th most touchdowns, and the 12th most fantasy points to running backs. Next up for me, I have Tank Bigsby ranked as an RB2 this week. I'm not sure if we have ever seen a turnaround from one year to the next like we've seen with Tank Bigsby. He has been absolutely incredible on a per touch basis this season. He ranks 3rd in missed tackles forced per attempt, and his 5.82 yards after contact ranks 1st among all running backs. While he's averaging only 8.6 fantasy points per game, his expected fantasy points is 23.7, which is incredible. So I think there is a lot of room for growth here. Obviously, we still have Travis Etienne within this offense. Either way, the Bears defense, this is a good matchup as the Bears defense has allowed the 4th most PPR points position. So I really like Tank Bigsby this week as another option. And then lastly is Najee Harris. Najee has been rather disappointing this season as he yet to produce a top 24 performance. However, this is due in some part because he hasn't found the end zone through 5 weeks. This week, though, that could change the matchup against the Raiders, who have yielded the 4th most PPR points to the position. And it also helps that Jaylen Warren is likely also out as well. So Najee Harris, I think, is an okay play in PPR formats. I don't necessarily love him just because he hasn't really done a whole lot, despite despite handling a pretty large workload within this backfield. But still, Najee Harris thinks in play.
Yeah, he was someone who I was actually going to bring up. The only other thing that I'll throw on top of here is the fact that I think part of this is due to, obviously you have Justin Fields who's been running a little bit, but then the Steelers offensive line has been extremely banged up. It's something they poured a ton of resources into, even going back to last year, obviously through the draft this year, taking 3 guys. They've just been super banged up. So I think between all the new pieces, everyone being banged up, that has hurt the run game here, because he's been in really good spots for the past 2 weeks. Indy only finishes RB33 last week against Dallas, RB30. So like you said, not hasn't been putting it together, but finds himself in another good spot here going up against Las Vegas. The other thing I wanted to touch on real quick was, obviously we have Jonathan Taylor at 18. That's because Kev has ranked him as if he's going to start. I have a little more reservation about that, so I just want to throw out that discrepancy there. They get Tennessee this week, which, on paper, it looks like it is a rough matchup, but they haven't really faced like a murderer's row of running backs either. They got bad DeAndre Swift in week 1. Week 2, we had Breece Hall and Braylon Allen combined for multiple touchdowns against them. Week 3 was the weird week for that offense with Malik Willis in the revenge game. And then on the ground between Jacobs and Emmanuel Wilson, they had less than 100 combined yards. And then in week 4, they had the Tua-less Dolphins. So I don't think there's a ton we can take away from there. So, if you have JT, you're obviously firing him up. The guy that I am low on this week, if you're looking at this as a start sit, I would be looking to sit Brian Robinson if you can. Now, obviously, it's really hard to sit someone who has not finished worse than RB22 on this week, but they get a matchup against an absolute pass funnel of a defense in the Baltimore Ravens. Last week, Robinson got you there because he found the end zone twice, but he only had 18 yards on 7 attempts. He did come into that with an injury. Obviously, they did not need him to run a bunch in the second half, so I think, he probably would have seen more touches had they been an actual competitive game. But still, if I have the ability to, he is someone who I would look to sit this week, because I just do not love this matchup whatsoever. He would be my sit of the week if I had to pick one. Kev, beyond the top 24, is there anyone else that you want to touch on here?
Travis Etienne appears to be losing his job to take Bigsby, but he's still heavily involved in the passing game with a 14% target share. Even with Bigsby eating into this role, he still produced 12 or more PPR points in 4 of the 5 games, making him at least worthy of a flex option. Next up are the Bucs running backs. Both are viable flex options this week against the Saints. Rashad White is starting to show signs of life, not just as a pass catcher, but also on the ground, as he racked up 70 yards with just 10 carries last week. Both running backs have low ceilings because they are splitting so many touches, but both should be viewed as RB3s moving forward. Also, it should be mentioned that Derek Carr is expected to miss multiple weeks there for the Saints. So, it sounds like maybe Spencer Rattler is going to be the starting quarterback, but that also, I think, makes that game script a little bit less exciting because, obviously, without Derek Carr, I think it's going to be a little bit rough there. So that also should be mentioned. Next up is Rico Dowdle. I've gone back and forth where to place him this week. He's coming off his best game of the season, scoring 19.4 fantasy points last week against a very good Steelers defense. On 22 touches, he racked up 114 yards and a receiving touchdown. He now has scored 13 or more PPR points the last 2 weeks. The reason he is an RB3 is based solely off the matchup. The Lions have been one of the stingiest defenses against the run all season. So I do think Rico Dowdle is somebody you probably look to play as a flex, but I'm not overly excited about it because this isn't a great matchup at all. Roschon Johnson is next up, remains a viable flex option as long as he continues to be utilized as the goal line back. But I wouldn't expect multiple touchdown performances every week. This game does set up nicely for Roschon to see 10 to 12 touches and have the chance to punch one into the end zone. Lastly, I just wanted to mention with Joe Mixon, he appeared to have a setback last week, and his status remains up in the air. If he misses another game, Cam Akers would step back into this role and play the lead back in this offense. Akers makes for a decent flex option with a matchup on tap against the Patriots, who have allowed the 11th most PPR points. Even if Mixon is out, it does seem like Dameon Pierce could be back as well. So that's something we should be monitoring there as well. But either way, I think Cam Akers at least is a viable flex option again.
The only things that I will add in here, Justice Hill, I think, is a viable flex option. Obviously, you need him to hit some of those explosive plays. But in a week where we have bye weeks and injuries, I think you can look to him. I know I was touching on sitting Brian Robinson. The Ravens have given up the 10th most receiving yards to running backs. So I think if you had to throw somebody like Austin Ekeler in your flex, you could do that. I think he's looked pretty good. A lot of people thought he was complete dust after last year, which he certainly looked to be that way. But I think being healthy and now in this role where he's not having to handle, 20 plus touches week in and week out, it has kind of helped him. It's helped keep him fresh. So I think you can look to him again as a flex option. And then lastly, Tyler Algier, you were kind of touching on some of the things that have been going wrong for Bijan. Still a fantastic matchup. So if you had to dig down for somebody like Tyler Algier, he's someone who's still available on waivers, actually. So if you had to pick him up and stream him basically for the week, I think you could do much worse. He's been getting pretty heavily involved over the past couple of weeks, as we have seen Bijan's opportunities and his touch share go down, like you were mentioning earlier. That is going to wrap it up for the Week 6 running back ranking show. Appreciate you rocking with us. Please be sure to hit that like and that sub. Any questions you have, you can go ahead and drop them in the comments below. We'll also be going live right here on the YouTube channel on Wednesday night around 10:30 to answer all of your start-sit questions, trades, waivers, all of that for the week ahead. So we will talk to you all soon.